Hello again from southeastern Finland in Northern Europe. I continue my video series of events from 1939, this time focusing on the events in September 1939 with Wikipedia as my main source, but since I have a master's degree in world history, I have read widely about this subject. For example, I have lived through a British-produced chronicle of the Second World War from about 1991, maybe, which follows events of the war day by day. So on September the 1st, 1939, officially the Second World War began in Europe, although unofficial we can say that already since July 1937 it had been going on in Eastern Asia, with the start of the first great Japanese invasion of Eastern China. And at 4:44 a.m. local time on Friday, September the 1st, 1939, the German invasion of Poland began when a German battleship, the SMS Schleswig-Holstein, which had sailed some days earlier to Danzig under the guise of a courtesy visit, opened fire on the Polish military garrison in Westerplatte. Despite being badly outnumbered and badly outgunned and so forth, the Polish soldiers put up a tremendous fight, and they only surrendered 6 days later on September the 7th, 1939. That morning, the German Air Force Luftwaffe began to bomb the Polish cities and towns, railways, bridges, and supply lines, also airports. Although contrary to an often repeated claim, even in various history textbooks, Poland had managed to move most of its airplanes already to camouflaged airfields in central and eastern Poland, and therefore only some Polish airplanes were destroyed on the airports. Despite being badly outnumbered, and despite including only some 400 mostly obsolete, in other words, old-fashioned airplanes, the Polish Air Force was able to effectively keep fighting the German Air Force, which was much larger one, including over 2,000 airplanes, until September the 14th, when the number of undamaged Polish military airplanes had shrunk to 54. Despite flying mostly obsolete airplanes, the Polish pilots were among the world's best trained ones, and those of them who were able to escape through the still neutral Romania, eventually to France and Britain, significantly contributed to the British Royal Air Force's successful defense of the country during the so-called Battle of Britain, which started in earnest in July 1940 and then continued until the spring of 1941. Also, another myth regarding the September campaign, or the first German, then Soviet, and then to a limited extent Slovak invasion of Poland must be corrected. Although Poland did have an uncommonly high percentage of cavalry troops, in other words, horsemen, some 8 to 10% of its standing army or armed forces in September 1939. Most of those horsemen did not foolhardily try to attack the German armored vehicles or tanks. There were some incidents, or a few incidents anyway, in which a German tank regiment or unit had surrounded a Polish cavalry unit, whose members had then tried to break out of the encirclement through a so-called cavalry charge. In other words, galloping, spurring their horses to gallop at full speed in order to escape the German tanks. And some 16 cavalry charges were executed during the September campaign by the beleaguered Polish army, and most of them, according to the English language Wikipedia article on the September campaign, were in fact successful. The Poles also put up a tremendous fight for several days, roughly from September the 9th to 15th, 1939, in northern Poland during the early stages of the so-called Battle of the Bzura River. They were able to significantly disrupt and even interrupt the German advance toward Warsaw. Although granted, by mid-September 1939, the tide turned. The Germans, who had about twice as many soldiers and then many more tanks and cannons and of course airplanes, then forced the Poles back into retreat, and only some thousands of those 225,000 or so Polish troops were able to break out of the encirclement and continue their fight in order to reach Warsaw and then to defend the Polish capital, which was already being besieged. So the series of battles, collectively known as the Battle of the Border, began in Poland. The Slovak Republic began a limited invasion of disputed Polish territories, meeting little resistance. At 5:40 a.m. Central European Time, the German dictator Hitler broadcast his declaration of war to the Wehrmacht, claiming the Polish state had refused the peaceful settlement of relations which Hitler had desired and appealed to arms. He was lying. So this was one of the many samples of Adolf Hitler's fake news. In order to put an end to this lunacy, meaning folly or insanity, I have no other choice than to meet force with force from now on. The German army will fight the battle for the honor and the vital rights of a newborn Germany with hard determination. The Polish president, Mr. Ignacy Mościcki, declared a state of emergency. The Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini orders his ambassador in Berlin, Germany, to ask for a telegram releasing Italy from any obligation to take part in the war. It would be only in June 1940 that Italy would visibly start participating in the Second World War, invading southeastern France at that time. At 9:40 a.m., Hitler obliged with a cordial telegram saying he did not expect to need Italy's military support in these circumstances. Hitler then appeared before the rubber stamp German parliament, the Reichstag, soon after 10 o'clock sharp in the morning, to explain his decision. He was wearing a field gray uniform instead of his usual brown jacket. And he declared, "From now on, I am just the first soldier of the German Reich. I have once more put on that coat that was the most sacred and dear to me. I will not take it off again until victory is assured, or I will not survive the outcome." As we turned out, he would not survive the outcome. He would commit suicide in the besieged Berlin on April the 30th, 1945, with his 12-year-long mistress and then wife of some 1.5 days, Eva Braun. The Polish personnel defended the Polish post office in Danzig for some 15 hours before surrendering, one of the many acts of bravery in the face of overwhelming odds by the Polish soldiers and even civilians who had access to weapons during the September campaign. Polish ships took minor damage in the Battle of the Danzig Bay. Mr. Albert Förster cancelled the constitution of the Free City of Danzig and decreed its reincorporation into Germany. US President Franklin Roosevelt said at a press conference that every effort would be made by his administration to stay out of the war. Critical teachers, researchers, and students of history would, of course, question the sincerity of this declaration, because surely President Roosevelt must have been realistic enough to understand that eventually the United States would have to enter the war, especially if it seemed that Britain and France, the United States' two major allies in Europe, would otherwise be overwhelmed by Germany, or at least they would have to extend their arsenal of human and military and other resources just to keep fighting effectively against Germany. It would be over 2 years before the United States would finally join the war on December the 7th or 8th, 1941, following the surprise Japanese air invasion of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. But Roosevelt was playing politics. He was probably catering to the large isolationist contingent of the US population. They basically declared, let the Europeans fight their own wars, we want to stay out of them. One of the most prominent isolationists in the United States at the time was the famous pilot Charles Lindbergh. Incidentally, his father was a Swedish-American immigrant. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain appeared before the House of Commons shortly after 6 o'clock in the evening British time. It now only remains for us to set our teeth and to enter upon this struggle, which we ourselves earnestly endeavored to avoid, with determination to see it through to the end, he declared. We shall enter it with a clear conscience, with the support of the Dominions and the British Empire, and the moral approval of the greater part of the world. At 9 p.m. local time, the British ambassador to Germany, Sir Neville Henderson, handed an ultimatum to the German Foreign Minister, Mr. Joachim von Ribbentrop. It declared that unless the British government received satisfactory assurances that Germany was prepared to withdraw from Polish territory, His Majesty's government would without hesitation fulfill its obligation to Poland. 1 hour later, the French ambassador delivered an identical note. I changed their obligation to its obligation because in the formal British English, government is often treated as a plural noun. I prefer to treat it as a single noun. On Saturday, September the 2nd, 1939, the state of emergency in Poland was upgraded to a state of war. The Polish army conducted the raid on Fraustadt. The Battle of Borowa Góra began. Italy proposed a peace conference between Germany, Italy, Britain, France, and Poland to address the Danzig Polish crisis. The French Prime Minister, Mr. Édouard Daladier, addressed the Chamber of Deputies, the French Parliament's lower house at the time, reviewing the past several days' events and France's commitment to intervene in Poland's defense. This is the question I lay before the French nation and all nations, Prime Minister Daladier said. At the very moment of the aggression against Poland, what value has the guarantee once more renewed given for our eastern frontier, for our Alsace, for our Lorraine, after repudiation of the guarantees given in turn to Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland? More powerful through their conquests, the aggressors would soon turn against France with all their forces. Thus, our honor is but the pledge of our own society. It is not that abstract and obsolete form of honor of which conquerors speak to justify their deeds of violence. It is the dignity of a peaceful people which bears hatred toward no other people in the world and which never embarks upon a war save only for the sake of its freedom and of its life. Ireland, which had become a free state in 1922 and had received its own constitution in 1937, had already elected its own parliament, the Dáil Éireann, or the Irish National Assembly, with the Seanad or Senate being appointed, and had already conducted its first presidential election in 1938, but was still technically in association with the British Empire, declared a state of emergency and neutrality in the war. This was one of the steps which the Irish nationalist government, led by Prime Minister Eamon de Valera, took in order to show that Ireland would henceforth seek to conduct its domestic and foreign affairs independently of Britain. And in 1948, it would formally leave the British Commonwealth of Nations. At 7:44 p.m., Neville Chamberlain informed the House of Commons that no reply had yet been received from Germany regarding last night's ultimatum. On Sunday, September 3rd, 1939, at 9:00 a.m., Britain gave Germany a deadline of 11:00 a.m. to announce that it was prepared to withdraw its troops from Poland, or else a state of war would exist between Britain and Germany. The deadline passed with no response. At 11:15 a.m., Neville Chamberlain declared on BBC Radio that Britain and Germany were at war. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed, Chamberlain said, sounding dispirited. Yet I cannot believe that there is anything more or anything different that I could have done and that would have been more successful. We and France are today in fulfillment of our obligations going to the aid of Poland, who is so bravely resisting this wicked and unprovoked attack upon her people. We have a clear conscience. We have done all that any country could do to establish peace, but a situation in which no word given by Germany's ruler could be trusted and no people or country could feel themselves safe had become intolerable. And now that we have resolved to finish it, I know that you will all play your part with calmness and courage. At 12 noon, France gave Germany an ultimatum similar to Britain's, with a 5 p.m. deadline. The deadline came and went with no reply, so France's war on Germany became official. Prime Minister Chamberlain addressed the House of Commons shortly past noon British time and called it a sad day for all of us, and to none is it sadder than to me. Everything that I have worked for, everything that I have hoped for, everything that I have believed in during my public life has crashed into ruins. There is only one thing left for me to do, that is to devote what strength and powers I have to forwarding the victory of the cause for which we have to sacrifice so much. I cannot tell what part I may be allowed to play myself. I trust I may live to see the day when Hitlerism has been destroyed and a liberated Europe has been reestablished. He would die of stomach cancer in November 1940, 6 months after resigning the prime ministership in favor of fellow conservative politician Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, who was called back to the government as the First Lord of the Admiralty, or effectively the British Navy Minister, agreed that it was a sad day, but said, "At the present time, there is another note which may be present, and that is a feeling of thankfulness that, if these great trials were to come upon our island, there is a generation of Britons here now ready to prove itself not unworthy of the days of yore, and not unworthy of those great men, the fathers of our land, who laid the foundations of our laws and shaped the greatness of our country. We are fighting to save the whole world from the pestilence of Nazi tyranny and in defense of all that is most sacred to man."
Hyvä. Minä pistin nyt